I used to believe that evil had a face, something twisted, maybe angry, obviously sinister. But I was wrong, completely wrong, and I learned it the hard way. Sometimes evil smiles at you. Sometimes it buys you coffee, listens to your heartbreaks, shows up when you need help moving apartments, and tells you you're like family. Sometimes evil wears the face of someone you've known for years, someone you called your best friend. For me, that someone was Darren. I met him when I was 19, just starting college, uncertain and hungry for connection. He was magnetic, funny without trying, effortlessly kind, seemingly grounded, with a little mystery that made you want to be closer. It wasn't long before we were inseparable. We joked about being soul twins, that weird cosmic bond where you just get each other. For years, he was my constant. Birthdays, breakups, new jobs, lost parents, first apartments, everything, everything, he was there. And I thought I was lucky. But now, I realized I was being studied, dissected, mirrored. My quirks, my past, my habits, all filed away for later use. I didn't know it then, but I was slowly being turned into a blueprint. Darren didn't want to be beside me. He wanted to become me. And I know how insane that sounds, how over the top and movie script it reads, but I swear to you, this is exactly what happened. It started with little things I didn't notice at the time. He began using the same toothpaste brand I did, said it was just a coincidence. Then he started signing up for the same classes, choosing the same electives. He began dressing more like me, buying jackets I had, growing the same beard style. I thought it was funny. I chalked it up to the kind of weird closeness best friends have. But looking back, it wasn't funny. It was strategic. I gave him everything without knowing. My passwords when I helped him with job applications, access to my resume files, copies of my ID when he offered to help scan documents for me. I trusted him like a brother. But he wasn't collecting memories. He was collecting data. I only started to get a strange feeling about it years later when odd things began happening. An insurance claim showed up under my name for an address I didn't recognize. A strange email from a recruiter mentioned a job I never applied to. Then, during a background check for a new apartment, I was told I had a delinquent account in another city I hadn't even visited in years. I thought it was some administrative glitch. I thought maybe there was someone with a similar name. I didn't connect the dots until I saw him post a photo from that city. It was a weird moment, just a flicker, but something in my stomach sank. The wallpaper behind him looked exactly like the one from a photo that had been emailed to me under my name weeks earlier, an image tied to the supposed apartment I'd rented. I zoomed in. My name was on the lease on the fridge behind him. It was small, blurry, but I knew that font. I knew that format. It was my document. But Darren was living there, under my name. And suddenly it wasn't a flicker. It was an explosion of realization that made my head ring. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark going through every interaction we'd had, every moment that had felt off and I had brushed away. The feeling that he always knew too much. The way he never introduced me to his own friends. The fact that I never met his family, though he claimed to have a close one. He had wrapped himself so tightly into my life that when I started to pull the threads, I couldn't tell where I ended and he began. Over the next week, I dug through everything: bank records, social media, credit reports. My identity had been duplicated like some grotesque doppelganger. He'd applied for loans under my name, created new email accounts slightly altered from mine, and even gone as far as to open dating profiles using my pictures. But here's the thing that hurt more than the money, more than the deception. He didn't just want to steal from me. He wanted to overwrite me. There were posts where he talked about his upbringing, his trauma, details ripped from my past, word for word. It wasn't fraud. It was erasure, a slow, methodical murder of my identity while keeping me alive to watch. He was becoming the me he thought I should have been, the version with better luck, more charisma, more applause. And in some warped way, I think he believed he deserved it more than I did. The worst part? He didn't even flinch when I finally confronted him. No denied, no panique. Just a chilling indifference that made me feel like I'd walked into the middle of someone else's life script where I was only a side character. That's when I realized the real theft wasn't in the credit cards or fake addresses. It was psychological. He had rehearsed my life so well he felt entitled to live it. And in his mind, maybe he thought I was the imposter. This story isn't about friendship gone wrong. It's about obsession dressed up in the costume of connection. It's about betrayal so deep it cuts through your concept of self. I was grieving something abstract, not just trust, not just finances, but the stolen continuity of my own identity. He wasn't content to copy me. He wanted to delete me and replace me, like I was a corrupted file in his master plan. And the scariest part is that it almost worked. After that confrontation, something inside me shattered. Not just trust, not just friendship, but my basic sense of safety. You don't expect betrayal from the person who once held your secrets like sacred gifts. You don't expect to look into a familiar face and see a stranger staring back, wearing your life like a second skin. I felt like I'd stepped out of my own body and was watching someone else live the life I had built. He had taken pieces of me, real pieces, not just data or documents, and molded them into something twisted and performative. Every memory I had with him now felt infected, retroactively poisoned. I started questioning everything. Well, he comforted me after my dad died. Was he taking mental notes? When he met my mom in the hospital, was he already imagining what it would be like to step into my role? This wasn't paranoia. It was reverse engineering of an entire life. I remember deleting every photo I had of us, not out of anger, but out of defense, as if clearing the evidence could protect me. But you can't delete what's already been replicated. That's when I learned he'd also faked an emergency to get a copy of my birth certificate months earlier. He'd posed as a relative, filed a request in a different state, and used it to create a second identity. Mine, but cleaner. No student debt. No overdue library fines. No medical history tying him to anxiety meds or therapy sessions. He didn't just want my life. He wanted a curated version of it. The version that erased all the messy parts and left him with a polished script to perform. And the terrifying part was how good he was at it. Employers bought it. Landlords bought it. Even people I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me, confused, wondering why I seemed different when they bumped into me in a different city. One person even asked if I was okay after a bizarre conversation outside a cafe I had never been to. My voice was shaking as I typed out messages saying it wasn't me, that someone had stolen my identity. But that kind of explanation sounds insane to most people. It's not something they can grasp without thinking you're either paranoid or lying. The more I tried to explain, the more unhinged I sounded. And maybe that was part of his plan all along, to make me question myself while he quietly replaced me. He didn't need to attack me directly. He just needed to become a better version of me than I could. And that's what truly broke me. Because when someone steals your bank account or hacks your email, there's a process, a recovery. You report it, you reset passwords, you start fresh. But when someone steals who you are, your story, your image, your voice, your identity, there's no cleanup protocol. There's just this floating, existential nausea that never settles. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I started doubting my own memories. Was that story really mine? Did I actually say that first? Did I share that detail? Or did he feed it back to me so many times that I believe it originated with me? That's the level of gaslighting we're talking about. Not the kind you recover from with a few affirmations in a therapy session. The kind that rewires your brain and leaves you standing in front of a mirror, wondering who's looking back. I tried going to the police, to identity theft hotlines, to cybercrime agencies. And they were sympathetic, somewhat. But identity theft that doesn't involve massive financial crimes tends to get buried under bureaucratic disinterest. The most chilling sentence I heard from an officer was this: technically, he's not pretending to be you. He's just using your information, as if the two could be separated, as if I was just a collection of data points. And the rest of me, my personality, my history, my social footprint, wasn't something worth protecting. That was when the spiral deepened. I stopped going out. I stopped posting online. I locked down every account, removed every photo I could find, purged anything that could help him keep sculpting his Frankenstein version of me. But it was too late. He'd already built a foundation. He wasn't stealing anymore. He was living. I became the ghost. And it was the most surreal, disorienting thing I've ever felt, to be alive, to still exist, but to feel like someone else was out there, doing a better job of it under my name. Then came the final insult. I received a notification from a university where I had applied to do a late master's degree. They told me my application had been denied due to suspected fraud, citing that I was already enrolled in a different program, one I hadn't applied to, but somehow I had been accepted to 6 months earlier. I asked for the student ID linked to that file. It was mine, my photo, my date of birth, but the address, the email, the phone number, they were all his. He had not only taken my past, he was now taking my future. And that's when I hit the wall. I knew I couldn't just clean this up with a few calls or documents. I needed to rebuild something deeper, my sense of self. I needed to unlearn the idea that I could ever go back to who I was before because that person had been cannibalized. What Darren did wasn't just identity theft. It was identity consumption. He wore me like a suit and discarded me like a shell. But I wasn't going to let him keep me. Not all of me. The one thing he hadn't taken was the wound itself. The trauma. The knowledge of what it feels like to be erased. And that, ironically, is what made me real again. Because he could wear my face, but he could never carry my pain. He could pretend to be me in every external way, but he didn't know what it felt like to survive being turned into a shadow. That's something he'll never fake. That was the seed of my recovery. That's where my fight began. Rebuilding myself started not with revenge, but with rage. Not the loud, explosive kind, but the quiet, slow-burning kind that simmers in your bones until it becomes fuel. I didn't want justice in the traditional sense anymore. I wanted clarity. I wanted to understand how someone I had once loved, like a brother, could orchestrate such a cold dismantling of my identity. I needed to trace the infection back to its source, to map the pathology of his obsession. So I did what anyone drowning does. I reached for the wreckage. I opened every old message, every shared document, every stupid in-joke we'd texted over the years. I cross-referenced metadata on photos, looked at timestamps, and tracked inconsistencies. It felt sick. It felt obsessive. But what I found broke me all over again. This hadn't started a year ago, or even 5 years ago. It had started almost from the beginning, in college, when I'd shown him my resume to help him build his own. He hadn't just copied the format. He had literally duplicated it, word for word, just swapping the name and school. When I talked about struggling with imposter syndrome, he started echoing that language in his journals, which I only read because he had once emailed me a draft of a personal growth article he wanted to publish. My words, my phrases, my pain, cut and pasted into his voice. At one point, I realized that even the girl I dated sophomore year, Emma, had messaged him years later, and he had told her a breakup story from his perspective as if it had happened to him. He even told her about a dream I once had, down to the absurd details, as though it had come from his own subconscious. Do you understand how insane that is? It wasn't identity theft anymore. It was identity infiltration. He hadn't stolen my life. He had moved in and redecorated. I felt like a house that had been squatted in. My soul vandalized. And still, the world didn't see it. Still, people believed him because he was charming, articulate, calm. Meanwhile, I had become paranoid, erratic, emotional, the exact traits that make you look unstable. In a story like this, he had inoculated himself with my likability and left me with the fallout. I realized the only way to reclaim anything was to go public, not through legal channels, not through police reports or identity theft filings, which had all hit walls or been met with vague sympathy, but through the truth, my version, my voice. So I began documenting everything. I wrote it all down: dates, emails, screenshots, videos, photos. I created a digital timeline that connected the moments I had ignored to the outcomes I was now suffering. And as I did, I discovered something else. I wasn't his first. Buried in an old hard drive, I found a folder he had accidentally synced to a shared cloud space years earlier. In it were photos of another guy. His name was Alex. He looked a bit like me. Same build, same hair color, same taste in clothes. I Googled him. Same pattern. Years earlier, Alex had filed reports about a roommate who had used his documents to open credit cards and pose as him at events. I messaged him, not knowing if he'd respond. But he did. And when we spoke, the horror magnified. It was the same story, different name, different setting, but the same manipulations, the same gradual imitation. Darren had a history. I wasn't special. I was a project, one in a series. When I told Alex what happened to me, he said something I'll never forget. He doesn't just steal identities, he harvests them. That was the word. Harvest. Because that's what it felt like. Like he sowed seeds inside people, waited for the best parts to bloom, then ripped them out. He wasn't interested in the boring pieces. He only wanted the traits that made us shine. Charisma, tragedy, potential, talent. And then he wore those parts like they were his. I realized that if I didn't tell this story, someone else might become the next Alex, the next me. So I started writing. I created anonymous posts online, detailing the psychological theft, the strange intersections between obsession and sociopathy, the quiet way evil can pretend to love you. And something incredible happened. People began reaching out, not just to say, I'm sorry, but to say this happened to me too. I learned that identity theft doesn't always look like someone hacking your bank account or stealing your social security number. Sometimes it looks like a friend, a lover, a sibling. Sometimes it's not about money at all. It's about erasing you so they can become a version of you that they believe deserves more. And the people who do this, they're not messy. They're meticulous. They are artists of erasure, sculptors of mimicry. And you never see it coming until the mask slips and it's already too late. I kept digging, and with every layer I uncovered, the more monstrous it became. Darren had also kept a journal, digital, encrypted but cracked because I knew him too well. Inside were notes about people, including me. Not feelings, metrics. He had analyzed my social reach, my family dynamics, even what emotional language worked best when talking to me. There were spreadsheets, flowcharts, and even predictive notes about how I'd react to specific triggers. I was a subject, a long-term psychological experiment. I cried so hard I felt like my ribs cracked. And yet, that's also when I stopped being afraid. Because now I knew the enemy. Now I understood the scope. And most importantly, I knew this wasn't my shame to carry anymore. He had studied me like I was a project. But in doing so, he had revealed his weakness. He couldn't create. He could only copy. And the one thing he could never truly replicate was the ability to recover, to rebuild, because that requires authenticity. And he had none. That's when the shift happened in me. I stopped playing defense. I stopped hiding. I started reclaiming my own story, not by running from what had happened, but by dragging it into the light and daring it to follow me. He could keep pretending to be me, but the real me, the one who had bled and broken and clawed his way back from the brink, he could never steal that version. That version was born from fire. When I began reclaiming my story, I expected pushback, maybe even threats, but I didn't expect silence. That was somehow worse. Darren didn't respond. Not a word. Not a post. Not a denial. Just absence. Like he vanished the moment I took control of the narrative, as if my voice was the only real weapon he couldn't predict. It was chilling, honestly, like watching a ghost retreat back into the walls after you finally scream its name. But then the silence broke, not from him, but from the echoes of people who had been circling around us all along. A former coworker messaged me saying they always thought something was off about how Darren talked about his past. A mutual friend admitted they'd seen inconsistencies but didn't want to be dramatic. One person even sent me screenshots of old DMs where Darren had described his childhood in exact detail, but it was my childhood, word for word. He'd taken stories I'd shared in confidence about my mother's hospitalizations, about my fear of drowning as a kid, even the birthmark. I was embarrassed. about and passed them off as his own personal history. People had heard these things and believed them, because why wouldn't they? He was convincing. He had the timing, the tone, the tears. And I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. He was better at being me than I was, at least from the outside, because he had studied how to edit my life into something palatable, inspirational, polished. He told my stories, but without the stuttering, without the self-doubt, without the awkwardness. He stripped away my humanity and left only the highlights. And that's what people bought. That's what they loved. And that's why they didn't see what he was doing, because they liked the version of me he performed more than the messy, real me struggling to survive it. That hurt in a way I can't explain. It wasn't just about being replaced. It was about being outperformed at being yourself. And that broke something inside me. But it also sharpened me. Because I realized then that I couldn't fight him by trying to win back the version of myself he had. Plagiarized. I had to become something he couldn't touch. I had to lean into the things he didn't want, the complexity, the darkness, the flaws. He couldn't fake those because he didn't understand them. He only understood the performance. He was an actor. I was the author. And authors don't audition for their own stories. They write new ones. So I started creating again, under my real name. I wrote essays. I posted videos. I told the truth without polish. Not to expose him, though that happened naturally, but to rebuild my reflection. I let people see the damage. I let them feel the blood still wet on the page. And slowly, people started to understand. Not all. Some still chose to believe him or were too uncomfortable to choose sides. But enough people saw through the cracks. Enough people saw the humanity behind the trauma. And something even stranger happened. Other victims started to come forward. Not just of Darren, of similar experiences. People who had been psychologically cloned, emotionally harvested, spiritually replicated by someone close. The term identity theft was too small for what we had gone through. This was soul mimicry, and it was more common than I ever imagined. One woman told me about her ex-best friend who slowly absorbed her mannerisms, her dreams, even her handwriting, until she felt like she was walking beside her own shadow. A man shared that his older brother had adopted his hobbies, his relationships, and then his career path, eventually claiming he'd had the ideas first. We were all different, but the emotional scars matched. There was a specific grief in all of us, the grief of being made redundant in our own lives. I realized we were part of a pattern, and naming that pattern gave us power. It wasn't just about me and Darren anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been emotionally colonized by someone they trusted. And that community, raw, damaged, real, became the scaffolding for my healing. But then Darren reappeared. Not to deny, not to apologize, but to reinvent. He launched a new online persona, completely detached from mine. New name, new backstory, new trauma. He started posting inspirational videos, talking about surviving childhood neglect, about rebuilding after betrayal, about discovering your true self. It was vile. He was now using his theft of my life as his narrative of victimhood. I watched a video where he talked about how someone had stolen his identity by spreading false stories. He never named me. He didn't have to. The performance was immaculate. And people believed him. Again, because that's what happens when sociopaths control the stage. They cry on cue and learn the lines faster than anyone else. I should have been devastated, but I wasn't. I was disgusted, yes. Angry, sure. But mostly, I was free, because I finally saw the cage he had built for himself. His entire existence was now a web of layered personas, none of which were rooted in truth. He had no core, no self, just a constantly shifting mask designed to extract sympathy and power from others. Meanwhile, I had scars, real ones, but also a spine, a voice, a map of my own pain that I no longer ran from. He could keep reinventing, but I had become uncopyable because my identity now wasn't based on what I showed the world. It was based on what I had survived. And survival is not something you can fabricate. It's not a story you steal. It's something you earn. So I kept speaking, kept writing, not out of revenge, but out of reclamation. And every time I told my story, I felt another part of myself locked back into place. I was no longer the victim of erasure. I was the author of return. And in the end, that's what he could. Never steal. The real me, forged in fire, unapologetically whole. The final step wasn't confrontation, it was disconnection. Not just from Darren, but from the version of me that needed validation, that craved justice in a world that rarely gives it. I stopped checking his profiles. I stopped monitoring the lies. I stopped begging the world to see what I had seen, because by then, I had realized something terrifying and liberating. The truth doesn't require witnesses. It exists even when no one believes it. My life, the real one, with all its cracks and bruises, was no longer about proving he had stolen it. It was about building something he could never reach. And so I disappeared from that old digital world. I deleted every account I didn't need. I burned the versions of myself that had been compromised, contaminated, reinterpreted by his parasitic narrative. I stopped trying to clean the infected identity and instead created a new one. Still mine, still true, but rooted in sovereignty. I moved cities. I changed careers. I legally adjusted parts of my name, not to hide, but to own it on my terms. Every part of this reinvention was mine alone, shaped not by theft, but by fire. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without checking over my shoulder. I no longer lived in fear of being copied, overwritten, or undone. Because I had discovered something he could never understand. Identity isn't what you present. It's what you survive. And I had survived him. The funny thing is, you expect the climax of a story like this to be some dramatic reckoning, a lawsuit, a takedown, an exposed fraudster left ruined. But real life doesn't always offer that kind of ending. There was no courtroom, no dramatic reveal. Darren still walks free, still spins stories to strangers, still performs empathy like it's an art. But I'm not waiting for karma anymore, because karma is slow and quiet and often invisible. Sometimes karma isn't a crash. It's a whisper in the night reminding you that you've built your whole life on other people's bones. Let him sit with that. Let him wake up every morning and wonder when the mask will slip. Let him fear that one day someone will love him deeply enough to finally see straight through him. That's his prison now. Me, I'm free. I've rebuilt my circle with people who see me, not a projection. People who know my story not because it's inspiring, but because it's real. I've learned how to live without needing to narrate every moment, without needing to prove that I exist. I've created again art, writing, a new rhythm of life, and it's raw, imperfect, and mine. There's a certain peace that comes with surviving identity theft on this level. Not just the legal kind, but the existential kind. Because once someone tries to erase you and fails, you become something else, something deeper. You become unreplicable. You become a living rejection of the lie they tried to build in your name. And maybe that's the real ending. Not revenge, not justice, but presence. To exist fully, knowing someone tried to delete you and couldn't. To breathe in a world that tried to replace you and say, I'm still here. Not as a copy, not as a reaction, but as a rebirth. So if you've ever felt like someone stole your voice, your story, your essence, know this: you're not broken. You're not lost. You're not a draft they get to edit. You are the final version. The version that chose to stand back up. That's something no imposter can ever perform. That's something no mimic can fake. That's the one truth no thief can erase. You're still you, and you're more real now than ever BEF.